Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown.
Hi, I'm so fascinated by this idea of time slips that I decided to do another video about, some more true encounters or true experiences reported, set in Cornwall, which is located in the west of England. And Cornwall is a fascinating place. It's really a very mysterious place. It's very ancient. And I used to actually live there, so I'm especially interested in that part of the world. Anyway, here are some detailed retelling of some of the most compelling and persistent time slip legends from Cornwall, as well as one or two perhaps not so well known ones. And the first one is actually based on the reported experiences of a documentary film crew in the 1980s, a modern classic of the genre that highlights the eerie, shifting nature of the Cornish rugged landscape. And the location is near the village of St. Breward, Bodmin Moor, Cornwall, and it's in late autumn, mid 1980s. Now, the fog on Bodmin Moor does not fall, it rises. It seeps out of the moss and the black peat, curling around the granite tors like a living breath, until the world is reduced to the few feet of tarmac visible beyond the bonnet of your car. It was into this suffocating whiteness that a small documentary film crew drove late one Thursday evening in October. There were 4 of them in the transit van. Mark, the director, a man whose patience had been frayed by 3 days of shooting B-roll in the drizzle, and Sarah, the sound recordist, and the 2 camera operators, Dave and Ken. They had spent the daylight hours filming the bleak industrial ruins of the copper mines near Minions, trying to capture the haunting desolation of Cornwall's industrial past. Now, they were cold, hungry, and hopelessly lost. The sat-nav era was decades away. They were navigating by the erratic glow of the dashboard lights and a crumpled Ordnance Survey map that Sarah was trying to read in the passenger seat. "We should have passed the turn for the A30 10 minutes ago," Sarah said, her voice tight. "I think we missed the landmark near the old quarry." Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I haven't seen a landmark in an hour. I haven't seen a house, a sheep, or a bloody pylon. It's just this fog." The van trundled down a single-track lane, the hedgerows towering high on either side, ancient banks of stone and earth topped with gorse that scraped against the metal of the van with a sound like fingernails on a blackboard. The heater was rattling, pushing out lukewarm air that smelled of damp upholstery and diesel. The mood in the van was one of heavy, exhausted silence. They were city people, used to street lights and 24-hour shops. The profound and suffocating darkness of rural Cornwall was unnerving them. "There," Dave said suddenly from the back, pointing between the front seats. "Light, up ahead." Mark squinted. Through the swirling mist, a soft amber glow diffused into a halo. It wasn't the harsh blue-white of a street lamp, but a warm, flickering invitation. As they crept closer, the shape of a building emerged from the gloom. It was a pub. It had to be. It sat nestled in a dip in the landscape, a low, long building with whitewashed stone walls that seemed to glow in the darkness. A heavy thatched roof hung low over small leaded windows, and smoke drifted lazily from a central chimney, carrying the scent of burning wood and sweet tobacco. "Thank God," Mark breathed. "Civilization." He pulled the van onto a patch of gravel at the side of the road. There were no other cars parked there, which struck Sarah as odd for a moment, given the lights were on, but the relief of finding a sanctuary outweighed the curiosity. They climbed out of the van, the damp air instantly biting at their skin. The silence of the moor was absolute. No wind, no distant traffic, just the crunch of their boots on the gravel. And above the door swung a heavy wooden sign. The paint was cracked and faded, depicting a stag with great antlers, but no name was legible. "Pint and a ploughman's." Ken rubbed his hands together. "I don't care what it's called." Mark pushed open the heavy oak door, and they stepped inside. The transition was instantaneous and overwhelming. The silence of the moor was shattered by a wall of sound. Laughter, the clinking of heavy glass, the low murmur of conversation, and the bright, tinny sound of a piano being played with gusto. The air was thick and hot, smelling of roasting meat, pipe smoke, and stale ale. The crew stood in the doorway, blinking, their eyes adjusting to the light. The pub was packed. It was a scene that felt less like a quiet Thursday night in a rural backwater and more like a New Year's Eve celebration. The low ceiling was stained yellow from years of smoke, held up by black oak beams that looked as old as the ships that had once sailed from Falmouth. "Busy night," Sarah whispered, clutching her equipment bag closer to her chest. They pushed their way to the bar. The patrons were a mix of locals, weather-beaten men in heavy tweed jackets and flat caps, women in floral dresses with cardigans draped over their shoulders. And there was a joviality to the room that felt intense, almost performative. No one looked at the strangers. No one glanced at the crew in their modern waterproofs and jeans, their North Face jackets and digital watches. The locals were engrossed in their dominoes, their darts, and their conversations. Mark reached the bar, a slab of dark polished wood that felt smooth and cool under his hand. Behind it stood the landlord, a man of immense proportions, with a red face and mutton chop whiskers that seemed to belong to a different century. He was wiping a glass with a rag that looked greyer than the fog outside. "Evening," Mark said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the piano. "4 pints of your best bitter, please, and do you have any food? We're starving." The landlord looked up. His eyes were bright, twinkling with a myrrh that Mark couldn't quite place. He didn't speak immediately, he just smiled. A wide, gummy smile, and nodded. He turned to the pumps, great brass handles that looked like antique fixtures, and began to pull the pints. The beer flowed, dark and flat with a creamy head that rose slowly. "Food?" Mark asked again. The landlord slid the 4 heavy, dimpled mugs across the wood. "Pasties," he said. His voice was a deep rumble, the Cornish accent so thick it was almost a different language. "Fresh out the oven." He produced a platter of Cornish pasties, their crusts golden and crimped to perfection. The smell was intoxicating, peppery beef and sweet onion. The crew didn't hesitate. They grabbed the food and the drinks, and Mark reached for his wallet. "How much?" Mark asked, pulling out a £10 note, a significant sum in the 1980s. The landlord shook his head. He pushed Mark's hand away gently. "No money here, Bo," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight's for the lads." Mark frowned. "I don't understand. It's on the house?" "On the house," the landlord repeated, winking. You enjoy. You look like you've travelled far." Confused but grateful, the crew took their haul to a small empty table in the corner near the fireplace. The fire was roaring, logs hissing, a sap boiled and popped. They ate voraciously. The pasties were the best they had ever tasted, rich, hot and filling. The beer was strong, with a metallic tang that Dave noted tasted like the old stuff my granddad used to drink. As the initial hunger subsided, the strangeness of the situation began to settle on them. Sarah was the first to voice it. She was looking around the room, her brow furrowed. "Look at them," she whispered, leaning in. "Look at the clothes." Mark glanced around. "What about them? It's the country. They're behind the times." "No," Sarah insisted. "I mean, really look. That woman over there, her hair is in a victory roll. And the men, those suits. The cut is all wrong for the 80s. It's all wrong for the 70s even. It looks like, I don't know, the 40s? Maybe it's a theme night," David suggested, wiping crumbs from his chin. "A reenactment society or something?" "But there are no cars," Sarah pointed out. "We're the only vehicle outside. How did they all get here? Did they walk across the moor in the fog?" Mark dismissed it. "Locals," he said. "They probably live in the cottages nearby. We just didn't see them in the fog." But the feeling of displacement grew. Sarah noticed other things. There was no cigarette machine, no jukebox. The music was coming from an upright piano played by a thin man in a waistcoat. And the money, when she saw money change hands at the bar between two locals, it clinked. It was coinage, heavy, large copper and silver coins. She didn't see a single banknote. She decided to go to the ladies' room. She navigated through the smoke and the crowd, excusing herself. But again, it was as if she were a ghost. They didn't move out of her way. She had to weave around them. When she reached the toilets, it was primitive, whitewashed stone, freezing cold, with a pull chain cistern and a smell of carbolic soap. There was a calendar on the back of the door, advertising a local feed merchant. Sarah squinted at the date. The bottom half was torn away, but the year, at the top, was printed in bold red. 1904? The last digit was obscured by a tear in the paper. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature went down her spine. She hurried back to the table. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. "We just got here," Ken complained. "I'm not finished." "Now, Mark, please." Something in her tone alerted Mark. He looked at her pale face. "Okay," he said slowly. "Okay, let's go." They stood up. Mark waved a thanks to the landlord, who was busy filling another round of mugs. The landlord looked up, caught Mark's eye, and raised a hand in a slow, solemn wave. It felt less like a goodbye and more like a blessing. They stepped out of the warmth and noise into the shock of the cold night. The door thudded shut behind them, and instantly the sound was cut off. It wasn't just muffled, it ceased. They scrambled into the van. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and he threw the van into gear, spinning the wheels on the gravel as he reversed onto the lane. "What was it?" Dave asked from the back. "What did you see, Sarah?" "The calendar," she said, staring out the window. "And the people. Did you see their eyes? They looked happy, too happy." They drove in silence for 20 minutes, the fog seeming to lift as they descended from the high moor. Suddenly, streetlights appeared. Then a road sign, A30 Bodmin. They were back in the known world. The next morning, the sun broke over Cornwall, bathing the moors in a crisp golden light. The terror of the previous night seemed foolish in the daylight. Over a breakfast of greasy eggs and bacon at their B&B in Bodmin, the crew debated the events. "It was just a country pub," Mark argued, though he sounded unconvinced. "We were tired. Imagination ran wild." "I want to go back," Sarah said. "I want to check." "We have a schedule," Mark said. "It's on the way," she insisted. "We have to go back up that lane to get to the location anyway. Please." Reluctantly, they agreed. They retraced their route. Without the fog, the landscape was rugged and beautiful, and they found the turn-off they had missed the night before. They found the long, winding lane with the high hedges. "It was along here," Mark said, slowing the van, "in the dip, before the sharp left turn." They drove and drove. They passed the sharp left turn. They turned around and drove back. "It was right here," Dave said, pointing to a patch of gravel on the side of the road. "This is where we parked. Look, you can see the tire tracks in the mud from where we spun out." Mark pulled the van over. They got out. The gravel patch was there. The tire tracks were there, frozen in the dried mud. But beyond the gravel, where the whitewashed inn with the thatched roof and the warm lights had stood, there was nothing. There was no building, no rubble, no foundation. There was only a field of rough grass, dotted with granite boulders and grazing sheep. An old rusted barbed wire fence ran through the space where the bar should have been. Sarah climbed over the fence, walking into the middle of the field. She stood where she estimated the table had been. The ground was uneven, lumpy with tussocks of grass. There was no smell of smoke, no smell of beer. But as she looked down, she saw something half buried in the molehill at her feet. She knelt and dug it out with her finger. It was a bottle cap. Not a modern screw-top cap or a shiny, jagged crown. It was a heavy, rusted piece of metal, almost disintegrated. But next to it, pushed into the soft earth, was something else. A coin. She rubbed the dirt away. It was heavy, blackened by age. It was a penny. A large pre-decimal penny. She squinted at the date, her heart hammering against her ribs. 1948. She looked up at the others who were standing by the van, staring at the empty field in silence. Later that week, before leaving Cornwall, Mark visited the local historical records office in Truro. He asked about a pub on that specific stretch of road near St. Breward. The archivist shook her head initially, but then paused. "There was a shepherd's hut there once," she said, "and legend says there was an unlicensed alehouse nearby centuries ago, but nothing in living memory." She pulled out an old map dating back to the late 1940s. "Wait," she said, tracing a line with her finger. "Here, it's not marked as a pub, it's marked as the Shepherd's Rest. It was a farmhouse." "What happened to it?" Mark asked. "It burned down," the archivist said, consulting a ledger. "October 1952. A chimney fire that got out of control during a harvest celebration. Tragic, really. The place was packed. Everyone got out, but the building was destroyed. It was never rebuilt." Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Did you say a celebration?" "Yes," she said. "Apparently the farmer was known for his generosity. He'd throw a party every year after the sheep were brought down from the high moor. Free food and drink for the village. They say he never charged a penny." Mark walked out of the records office and into the bright Cornish afternoon, the noise of the traffic sounding harsh and abrasive. He thought of the warm light, the laughter, the taste of the beer and the landlord's wave. They hadn't just stumbled into a pub. They had stumbled into a memory. A moment of joy and generosity burned into the fabric of the moor, playing over and over in the fog, waiting for lost travellers to step inside and share the warmth just one last time. The atmospheric trigger. Almost every Cornish time slip is preceded by a sudden change in weather, specifically a thickening of the air or a sudden unnatural silence, known as the Oz factor in paranormal research, which I've talked about before in the previous video about time slips. The notorious sea mists of Cornwall are often cited as the veil between times. Unlike ghost sightings, which are often visual only, time slips in Cornwall are reported as multisensory. Witnesses describe the smell of wood smoke, for example, the taste of food, and the tactile sensation of furniture, only for the physical evidence to vanish later. And this is what's really fascinating, to imagine that you could actually slip back in time or into a portal, time capsule, if you like, and you actually eat food there. You actually can touch things, and people can talk to you. You can talk to them, and that's fascinating. Interestingly, many Cornish time slips involving buildings are not malevolent. They often seem to involve scenes of hospitality, inns, festivals, or open homes, suggesting a recording of high emotional energy, stone tape theory, or a genuine temporary bridge to a happier past. This specific story aligns with the famous Rough Tor incident and the Traveller's Rest anomalies reported in the 1970s and 80s, where hikers or drivers would report buildings that simply did not exist on any map. So another series of stories I have here, true stories about time slips, also set in Cornwall, are in different parts of Cornwall. One's in Truro and one's in Boscastle. Cornwall has long been regarded by folklorists and psychical researchers as a thin place, a limestone and granite peninsula where the boundaries between the past and present seem kind of porous. Whilst ghost stories usually involve the dead returning to the present, as I've said before, time slips are a distinct phenomenon where the living seem to stumble, usually quite by accident, into the past. And the following collection details 3 specific narrative accounts based on reported phenomena in Truro and Boscastle. These stories are reconstructed from local testimony, archival witness reports, and the oral traditions that circulate in Cornish paranormal circles. The city of Truro is dominated by its neo-Gothic cathedral, a structure that looks ancient but was actually begun in 1880. It's here in the narrow cobbled alleyways surrounding High Cross and St Mary's Street that one of Cornwall's most persistent urban legends takes place. This specific account dates from the mid-1990s, but aligns with similar reports from the 1950s and 1970s. In November 1994, a woman named, let's call her Sarah, was shopping in Truro on a busy Tuesday afternoon. It was drizzling, a common persistent Cornish mizzle, and the streets were clogged with delivery trucks and pedestrians with umbrellas. Sarah had just left a modern chain store and was cutting through a narrow passage towards St Mary's Street, intending to visit the Old Pannier Market. As she described it later to researchers, the transition was not instant but climatic. It began with a sudden dropping away of sound. The roar of the traffic on the main road, the beep of reversing lorries, and the chatter of shoppers didn't just fade. They were sheared away and replaced by a dense, kind of oppressive silence. And this, of course, is the hallmark of the time slip phenomena. Sarah walked out of the alleyway and stopped dead. The paved tarmac of the street was gone, replaced by uneven, slick cobblestones that hurt her feet through her thin soles. The modern shop fronts, with their neon signs and glass plate windows, had vanished. Instead, she was looking at a row of darker, grimier buildings made of soot-stained local stone. The air smelled different, acrid, heavy with the scent of wet wool, horse manure, and the distinct sulphurous bite of coal smoke, a smell that had largely vanished from modern British cities. And most jarringly, the cathedral itself was different. In 1994, the cathedral was a finished, weathered monument, but when Sarah looked up, she saw the centre tower was shrouded in wooden scaffolding, great pale poles lashed together with rope, not the metal piping of modern construction. There were men working near the base, but they were silent. They wore rough, dark waistcoats, collarless shirts and flat caps. She saw a horse-drawn cart filled with stone blocks, likely the pale Bath stone or Mabe granite used for the construction, standing stationary near where the war memorial would one day be. Sarah reported feeling a wave of nausea and dizziness, a sensation often likened to seasickness. She realized with a jolt that there were no cars. The few people passing her, women in long, dark shawls and bonnets, men in heavy coats, seemed to be moving in a slightly jerky, staccato rhythm, like an old film reel. They did not look at her. It was as if she were a ghost to them. She stood frozen, afraid that if she moved, she would be trapped. She fixed her eyes on a specific shop window, a chemist's shop with large coloured glass carboys, large glass vessels, in the window glowing with red and blue liquids. This detail correlates with the history of William White's chemist shop in Truro, famously discovered as a time capsule in later years, suggesting she may have seen it in its operational prime. The slip ended as abruptly as it began. A car horn blared and the overlay of the past shattered. The noise of 1994 rushed back in a physical wave. She blinked, and the wooden scaffolding was gone. The cathedral was whole, and the street was paved again. Sarah was found leaning against a wall, pale and shaking, by a passerby who asked if she was diabetic. She never walked down that specific alleyway again. The Valency Valley runs inland from Boscastle Harbour. It's a place of deep ancient woods, rushing water and steep hillsides. It's famously associated with the author Thomas Hardy, who courted his first wife here in the 1870s. However, the valley has a reputation that predates Hardy, a reputation for being a place where the veil is exceedingly thin. This story comes from a solo hiker, a man named David, who experienced a time slip in the summer of 2011. David was an experienced walker who was hiking the path from Boscastle up towards St. Juliet's Church, the Hardy Church. It was a hot, humid day in August. The valley was lush and green, buzzing with insects and the sound of the River Valency moving over the rocks. About a mile inland from the harbour, the path narrows and runs under a canopy of ancient sessile oaks. As David walked, he entered a patch of shade that felt disproportionately cold. He checked his watch, noting it was just past noon. As he looked up from his wrist, the atmosphere changed. That Oz factor struck hard. The buzzing of the bees and the sound of the river vanished. The air went still and dead. The light changed from the bright, flat glare of an August noon to a grey, silvery twilight, as if the sun had suddenly been eclipsed or obscured by heavy winter clouds. David kept walking, feeling a rising sense of panic. The path, which had been a well-maintained dirt track for tourists, was now a muddy, rutted mess, deeply scarred by cart tracks. The trees around him looked different, younger, perhaps, or just managed differently. The undergrowth was thicker, wilder. He rounded a bend in the river and saw a group of people. They were gathered near the water's edge. In 2011, this would have been a group of hikers in bright Gore-Tex and backpacks. These people were silent, motionless, and dressed in rags. David described them as wretched. There were 3 men and a woman. The men wore loose canvas-like trousers and rough shirts. The woman was in a dark, shapeless dress that dragged in the mud. They were staring at something in the river. David followed their gaze and saw a small broken boat, a rowing punt jammed against the rocks. He felt an overwhelming wave of despair emanating from the group. It wasn't just a visual hallucination, it was emotional. He felt their hunger and their exhaustion. He realized he was looking at the rural poor of the mid-19th century, perhaps the hungry 40s, a time of famine and desperation in Cornwall. The scene had the quality of a 3-dimensional photograph. No one moved. Yet they weren't statues, they were paused. David tried to call out, to ask if they needed help, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt that if he made a sound, he would shatter something fragile. He took a step forward and his boot crunched loudly on a dry twig. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. Instantly, the grey light fractured. The sun slammed back down. The heat returned and the sound of the river rushed into his ears. He was standing alone on the path. The muddy ruts were gone. The group of people was gone. The boat was gone. David sat on a nearby rock for 20 minutes trying to steady his breathing. When he later researched the history of the valley, he found no specific record of a tragedy at that spot. But the description of the clothing matched the mid-1800s perfectly. He believed he had walked into a memory of the land itself, perhaps a moment where locals had found a wreck or lost a boat during a flood, an event of such emotional intensity that it imprinted on the environment, waiting for a sensitive passerby to replay it. What makes the Cornwall time slips, and specifically those in the Truro and Boscastle areas, so compelling is their consistency. They are rarely frightening in the Hollywood sense. There are no jump scares. Instead, they're characterized by a profound sense of dislocation. Geologists have often pointed to the high quartz content in the granite of the Cornish peninsula. Quartz can generate an electric charge under stress. Some theories suggest that the tectonic stresses deep in the fault lines of Cornwall, like the one running through Boscastle, create localized electromagnetic fields that might interact with the human brain, causing hallucinations, or, if one believes in the more exotic theories, actually warping the fabric of space-time. Whether these are hallucinations induced by the environment or genuine slips through a fissure in time, the stories from Truro and Boscastle areas remain some of the most detailed and atmospheric in British folklore. They really do remind us that in these ancient corners of the world, the past is never truly gone. It is just waiting for the fog to clear. Thank you for joining me. And if you like the stories, feel free to subscribe, like, and comment. And feel free to share your own stories of the paranormal, of time slips, or anything else that you'd like to share relating to the paranormal or specifically time slips. See you next time.